We're here at Ballinafad United Church on the 7th of August 2009 with, will you give us your name and your age and where you live now?
My name is Richardson McIntyre and I'm 59 and I live just west of Acton currently.
Did your family settle in or near this Ballinafad community as pioneers? If you can give us any idea of dates.
Yes, they did. My family didn't live at Fallbrook as such, but our family received 100 acres of land on the west half of Lot 28 of the 9th concession of its squeezing in 1864. And there has been a continuing line of Shortles living there until the late 1940s.
Do you have any relatives still living in this area?
No, not currently.
How did your family make a living after they settled here, on a farm or otherwise? If they were on a farm, are they still farming?
No, both of my parents have passed away, but all of the previous generations and my father farmed this particular parcel of land that I was speaking about. A rocky piece of land. And when he was able to move to the 6th line of the squeezing, he actually felt he had some arable land at last.
Used to ride the stone boat when we were...
The stone boat, yes. Absolutely. That's where the fences came from as well. The fence bottoms were full of stones. Yeah.
At what generation was the first move off the farm? Was that your generation?
Yes. Yes. My father farmed until he was in his 50s, and then he became a jail guard until he retired from that at 65.
Where did your family originate from before moving into this community?
Well, this land was deeded to the Irish ancestor who came over in around 1843. But he moved to this area in 1864.
Where did he go first?
I believe they landed at Montreal, and I can't tell you. He came to Ontario, but that I would need to look that up. I don't have that at my fingertips.
You know what part of Ireland he came from?
He came from Tipperary, but I don't know if it was Tipperary Village or the county of Tipperary.
Have you been there to look?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
Find any records?
No, we weren't there long enough to delve into that.
Okay.
We were just there at the end of a holiday for a couple of hours in the morning with our two boys. So we weren't doing any ancestral research at that point. Something for the future.
So, given that you have quite a strong Irish background, how do you view yourself? As Canadian? Irish? Irish-Canadian? What?
My mother's side of the family also has Irish roots, so it is quite strong. I view myself totally as a Canadian, but the strangest feeling came over me on our first trip to Ireland after I had been there approximately a day. I felt like I'd come home, which was just a totally odd sensation.
Say more about it?
Without any effort at trying to develop the brogue, by the time I'd been there a day, I had a shopkeeper ask me which county I was from. He couldn't quite place the accent. So, somehow it's still in the genes after all of those generations.
It's kind of spooky, huh?
But it was an odd feeling. Like, I didn't tell people for quite a while because I thought this is just totally odd. But it was truly, that was the feeling that washed over me. Oh, I'm home.
Did you ever know any of the McKay family, or were you familiar at all with Fallbrook Farm?
Didn't know Sandy and Aggie McKay, just some stories in our family from my father would have worked with Sandy as neighbouring farmers, and they often shared tools and chores, that kind of thing. My father had to take over the farm at a very young age, and Sandy was a very good, supportive neighbour for him. Fallbrook Farm I know of because of our association with the Keers. When they came from Scotland, they came to Ballinafad Church and became very close friends of my mother and father. I was 10 at that time. So I remember playing over at Fallbrook with Irene and Robert, and running around there and through O.D. Bond's property on the other side of the 9th line. Actually, that would be the 10th line his property was on, I think.
Oh, nice.
Kitty Corner.
Oh.
Kitty Corner to Fallbrook. So yes, and Irene and I have remained friends. I'm not in touch much with Robert, he's in the city. Irene and I have been friends. We've both taught, and we've crossed paths through education.
Did you ever hear of, talk of, or evidence of First Nations being on the property in Scottsdale or Fallbrook or between the two? Do you remember?
Not at all with Fallbrook until this recent exploration. When I was vice principal at Limehouse School, I became aware then that there had been an Indian settlement on Scottsdale because one of our classes was heading out there for a dig. And I thought, oh my gracious, I've lived all my life in the area and never had any idea that, I mean, it would stand to reason that they were here previous to the rest of us, but I had never heard of any evidence of it, of their settlements. Yeah.
Do you remember any boys showing artifacts that sort of show and tell time, arrowheads or strange shaped stones or anything of that nature?
No. No.
You know that the University of Laurentian did the digs on that farm.
That's who was conducting it at the
3
time.
summers, yeah.
Yes, yeah.
We have the CD reports of
Oh, interesting.
their dig. It's quite
Yeah.
extensive.
I thought this was fascinating. These little kids were going out to that area.
Now, you want to go right down to this question
I think
here?
maybe.
Okay. I'm going to go to the one before, just up, and before we go
Okay.
into all the work that you've done. Do you have any funny stories about life around the Ballinafad? And you don't. My goodness.
Precisely why I didn't think you'd ask that question.
Okay, well let's talk then about the various roles of men and women that you are familiar with in the area of Ballinafad. How their workload, the type of work they did varied and was different. Tell us what you have prepared for us here.
Well, I thought I'd focus on the what I remember of the women's, or was aware of the women's role. And I would say this probably applies to the 1940s, maybe 30s. I'm too far away for me to know for sure how applicable it is. But the 40s, 50s, and sort of the 60s, just gauging from what I knew of the women in the community, and particularly my mother's role within that, most of the families in the community farmed. And that meant that most of the women spent their lives managing the household. Men were involved in all of the farming activities. Sometimes the women helped in particular ways. At our place, Dad basically did the farming manual labor and Mum managed the household as such. And anything that was connected to the household. So children were basically the woman's responsibility. There were no daycares. So, you know, you were underfoot for all of their working days. They would be responsible for the food. It wasn't a shared responsibility as we see oftentimes now in marriages. The women would be constantly preparing meals, and mostly from scratch, meaning that there weren't many packaged, canned things that came into the household. All the ingredients would come in, or they would have been grown in the gardens themselves. And the meals were basically, I think, prepared by the women of the household. So they were baking most days, tending to the garden, planting and tending to the garden, canning fruits from the harvest, and pickling relishes and cucumber pickles and all that sort of thing to make meals a little more interesting through the winter. And they were responsible for any special preparations, like when there would be a thrashing or a corned beef. They would be preparing meals for up to a dozen men at lunch. Friends and relatives would be invited over, usually for a Sunday dinner. Not much entertaining going on through the week, but usually for Sunday dinner. And of course all the related household chores of cleaning and laundry and washing dishes after every meal and baking. There were, dishwashers weren't available at that point in time. And I remember, probably fairly common, Monday was wash day and Tuesday was ironing. And at our house, Saturday was when the kitchen linoleum floor was scrubbed regularly, and Mum would have on the Metropolitan Opera from New York. She had a musical talent, had some training, and I can remember every Saturday afternoon listening to that opera. So it was a real thrill to be in Milan this past October and be in La Scala. It was a particular thrill for me. The women also would have been involved in community activities, both as participants but also as leaders in particular activities. They might not have been chairperson of the board, but they were very instrumental in raising the money for the church board to spend, and certainly would have had their say behind the scenes. So I think the women in Balnafad were involved in church, in choirs. There was always a senior and a junior choir. In the UCW, which was the United Church Women. In Women's Institute, there would have been a baby band, mission band. They taught Sunday school. They taught CGIT, Canadian Girls in Training. They organized, prepared the food for, and cleaned up, served and cleaned up for fowl suppers, which was where a good deal of that money was raised for the church to keep it going. And also, Grace McHenry and my mother were instrumental in setting up 4-H clubs for the girls in the area. And through 4-H, they would have taught cooking and sewing classes, because at school there was no family studies program in that day and age.
Can you say any more about 4-H? We haven't heard that much about it. Were you part of it?
For some reason, I was never part of 4-H. So when I say I don't have a lot of memories about, I'm not just quite sure why. Whether they ran out of steam by the time I got to be old enough to be in there, or they didn't want to tackle the next generation, I'm not sure. But what they would do would be, they'd have projects that, it was a structured program. I don't know if it came out from the Department of Agriculture. I don't know where the course of study would have come from. But they would have these projects that the girls would do, and then they would take them up in the spring to College Royal at the University of Guelph, where 4-H clubs from around the area would gather and present their poster boards and their materials and things. So I remember going there, but never as a participant, just as a tag-along, a little one. Yeah.
I'm trying to remember what on earth the 4-H stood for. Health?
Health, home,
heart.
hand and heart.
Really?
Health, home, hand and heart. There we go.
I learned something.
I've heard that before, but I hadn't remembered it at all. And of course there was, there would have been, in 4-H clubs, they could have been involved in raising animals, cattle, or judging. I remember my father talking about when he was involved in junior farmers, they learned how to judge grain and wheat and milk and cream products, cheese products, and that sort of thing.
And livestock.
And livestock, yes. He had won an award for that and was in Chicago on a junior farmer convention as a representative from this area, because he had won an award for his judging, and it was the day Prohibition ended. Said the streets were fair flowing. Yeah. One of the other things that I think in those particular days and in small communities, they created their own entertainment. There would have been Christmas concerts to be planned and practiced for, and costumes and all of that sort of thing. And they had what they called garden parties. Those would be outdoor parties in a park, would they, Jim? Is that right? I remember my parents singing at those, which would be why I was there. But I would just have been, 5, 6.
How was that different from, say, a picnic?
I think it was at night, and I think it was more the entertainment, as opposed to a Sunday school picnic, which might have had a service and the food and the conversation and the races and games. I think it was more, they would have more entertainment. They would have people singing and reciting, that sort of thing, playing instruments.
Do you remember any visiting reciters coming?
There was a lady from Ospringe. Was her name Flora Bruce? Is that right, Dorothy? Yes. And Aunt Grace McHenry. Not truly my aunt, but Grace McHenry recited well, often. That type of thing.
Do you ever remember a lady from Norval?
No, I don't. Do you remember her name?
Lucy Maud.
Oh, no, I don't remember her. But of course, I've read her material, her book.
But apparently she was...
Did she recite?
She used to come and recite.
In this area? I think that might have been a little before my time.
I think so, but I thought you might have heard it in the
Heard
family.
the stories, yes. No.
No, that came from Viola.
Right?
Yeah.
Oh.
And to her, Lucy Maud Montgomery was the girl from Norval.
Of course.
Of course.
She did live there quite a while.
Yeah.
Well, Norval has claimed her as well. Yeah. So there would have been, as I said, the concerts and the garden parties. There were operettas, Gilbert and Sullivan operettas in Erin. And I remember as a little 4- and 5-year-old going with my parents to practice because they sang in these operettas and falling asleep on the desks because they rehearsed in the Erin High School. So that was another form of entertainment at that point in time. And of course dances, euchres. Some of my ancestors played for the dances, but my father didn't. However, that generation were beautiful dancers. It was lovely to watch them do the different dances. Yeah, a lost art, pretty much. And I was thinking about the women again and their lives on the farm. As a farm wife, you needed to know how to be able to mend and darn. Skills that are long gone, I fear, at least personally. And they were able to make their own clothes as well. And I think there's, that's a dying art. And other forms of needlework, they did knitting and embroidery and crocheting and rug hooking and smocking and tatting and quilting. My mother did all of those. I might be able to do one of those.
Quilting was kind of a community activity.
Yeah. Quilting took place in the homes in the winter usually. They were too busy in the summer. And in the winter they would set up the quilt frames, maybe in the living room. My father had made a set of quilt frames that were used. And so you'd come home from school and there would be the women gathered. There'd be 2 or 3 or 4 gathered around the square of the quilt frames, stitching. Mm-hmm. And they could identify who had stitched where. Even if they hadn't seen who had stitched where by that time too. So there's a little competition and a bit of an art and skill to doing that. The finer the stitching, the better. Yeah, it was social as well as purposeful. Mm-hmm. Teapot would go on and there'd be a sweet or two. One of the other things I thought about just kind of recently was if you were ill, that woman would be the first caregiver. She took care of whatever. before you were considered serious enough to see a doctor. So that was kind of an important role. And also, the elderly were cared for in your own home. Usually, I can think of several relatives who maybe moved between their children. We had my grandfather live with us for the last part of his life. And that became the woman's role again, to care for someone who was not able really to manage on their own any longer.
My grandmother was in our living room, I think, until she died.
Yeah. My grandfather was with us until he was hospitalized the last time.
Did women go in the fields much? Harvest time?
I can only really speak from my family's point of view, because when I listened to Marilyn Linstead speak, she said her mother was quite involved in the farming operation, and I wasn't really aware of that, but certainly not at our place. No, my father saw that as his role, and I think my mother was happy to let him see that as his role. And no, we weren't. I mean, as a child, I would do the odd little thing, the odd little chore. But no, he didn't really feel, from his point of view, that that was a woman's role. He was very independent and capable. So
you would likely feed
managed.
chickens and gather the eggs and a few things like that, would you?
Mum had chickens, yes, and I was supposed to gather the eggs, but I hated it with a passion. And having allergies, going into a moldy, mildewy, feathery chicken house with straw, and was not actually all that healthy. And I would go in to collect the eggs up to a certain age, and if the hen houses had rows of boxes, and the hens nested in each of these boxes. Well, if there was a hen here, I didn't touch the eggs here. If there was a hen on either side of the nest, I didn't go in between them to get the eggs. So it became obvious fairly soon on that it was pointless in sending me out to gather the eggs, because it looked as though they hadn't laid a thing that day. So I got asked to do other things. I got out of washing dishes by practicing the piano. It was one or the other, so I did take the piano over the dishpan.
Did you take piano lessons?
Yes. I had my grade 8 piano, grade 2 theory. Music was important in our house in particular.
Who was your music teacher?
Oh, I had several. I had Helen Lonsborough in Acton. Can't remember her first name, Mrs. Skull. She lived up the 7th line near Peacock. Actually, yes, near Peacock. And most of my lessons came from Dale Wood, currently the director of the Georgetown Choral Society.
What was that name again?
Dale Wood. Yeah.
What do you think were the reasons that the families moved away?
I think farming just died as a viable family industry.
Enterprise.
Yes. It wasn't possible any longer to make a decent living.
Why have so many new people come to live in Ballinafad area?
I don't really know, other than the migration from the city. I mean, it's a lovely little community, but...
How do they help to continue the community? Do they get involved? Do you find them easy to know?
Well, see, I don't live in the
But
community,
you don't
so I don't
live
know.
there anymore, do you?
I really have no idea.
Skip down to the last one.
What do you feel was your contribution to life in Ballinafad, and how did living there change or enrich your life?
I don't think I made any contribution particularly to being here, because I left when I was 19. So, you know, I participated in everything that was going on. I don't think I in particular contributed in the way that my parents would have been. I think both of them were held some leadership roles within the community and attended church here and were part of a community all of their lives.
Do you want any more about their contribution? Did Ross give you quite a bit on that?
No, Ross didn't actually.
Want to say a bit more, because they were pretty key people in the community.
Well, you might be able to say as well as I could what they were. I think they both were well regarded. If there were any construction projects or things like that, my father would have been involved when they put the basement under the church. He would have been one of the men instrumental in having that move forward successfully. They would have served on the church board. They were both involved in choirs. My father sang in choirs for more than 70 years.
He also
most of that
taught
here.
me to sing bass in the choir.
He taught you to sing bass.
I have to tell this story about your father and my father working on the church.
Yes.
Because your father told this story at my dad's funeral, I think.
Oh.
And they were putting on roofing. They were doing the roof, and my dad was the shingler. He was the carpenter up top, and the men were carrying the shingles up the ladder, which was quite a heavy...
to keep him going.
Yeah, to keep him going, and I guess he ran out or something. He shouted down anyway to complain. He was running out of shingles, and your dad said he was getting pretty tired. He didn't really want to do it because because my dad was shouting, he decided to pick up 2 bundles and take them up, which was really a heavy load. And he took them up to see if my dad was pleased, and my dad said, "Well, I'm glad to have the shingles, but you didn't have to bring them all at once."
Oh dear. Huh.
He was usually fairly sarcastic, or at least sharp anyway.
Well, the two of them worked together. I remember in the winter time, sometimes my father would come in and work for your dad at the mill.
That's right.
Winter times were slower on the farm, and any extra little cash or exchange in services for goods that you could get was always appreciated. So I remember my dad coming over to work at the Kirkwood mill.
He and I played hockey together on the team pretty well too. He was a defenseman.
My dad played with you on a hockey team? Really?
Yeah.
I remember him talking about playing hockey in the pad. And
Yeah.
yes, he loved sport.
We had a good team. Yeah.
Anything he did, he tried to do very well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they were both involved in church activities and choirs and social activities.
Your mother was a beautiful singer. She really was.
She had some training.
And she was known for that.
Yes, she sang. She sang all around the countryside, and they sang duets.
Duets, all
Yes.
yes.
Yeah. For many weddings and church anniversaries and garden parties and that sort of thing. So, yeah, a love of music there.
And we see their piano sitting there that they donated to the church here.
Yes. Much of this is my family has contributed to. My uncle donated money, left in his will, money to the church. So this room, in fact, has part of his money in that. And my father is responsible for, I believe, for the paving in the rock garden outside. I think, he was always trying to improve things in some particular way. Always found it exasperating that you made some improvements around the house or the farm, around the house, and then you got taxed more for it, for your efforts. He couldn't see the justice to that, actually.
I still can't.
No.
Who was your uncle? Was that Bob?
Uncle Bob.
Yeah.
Robert Chartle. He was Dad's elder brother.
Yeah.
And he did not want to farm.
Yeah.
And Freddie had to farm, whether he wanted to or not. So, yeah. I remember when my father was in grade 9 at high school. That was when number 7 highway was being built. We were speaking earlier of the stone boats. Well, they had horses in a stone boat, and they had this 13-year-old boy who could drive them, so that's where some of the money came for his family that winter, was bringing the horses in the stone boat over for the work crews to use on building number 7 highway at Silver Creek there. Education wasn't valued in quite the same way as some of us value it today. Money and food on the table was a little more important at that point in time. And his father had died, so that's why he needed to be useful.
Was it a pair of horses, team of horses, or one horse?
What did they put on a stone boat, Jim? I don't know for sure.
Just one?
A little before my time. So I know some of this by story rather than by having been there.
Okay.
So that was, I have this right, that was your father who worked the stone boat?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Any last word you wanted to put in?
No, not really. I don't think so.
Thanks very much for
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Yeah.